Tom had been dreaming about this moment for years. After spending 3 decades working as a civil engineer, moving from one project to another, living in apartments and temporary housing, he was finally ready to build his own place. Not just any place, though. He wanted land, real land, the kind where you could step outside in the morning, breathe fresh air, and not see another building for miles. He spent nearly 3 years looking. Every weekend, he would drive out to different counties, meeting with real estate agents, walking through properties, and checking out parcels of land. Some were too expensive. Others were too close to the highway. A few had soil problems or were in flood zones. Tom was patient, though. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he was willing to wait for the right piece of land to come along. Then one Saturday morning in early spring, his real estate agent called him with excitement in her voice. She had found something special. A 15-acre property tucked away in the hills of rural Virginia. Rolling terrain, mature trees, a small creek running through one corner, and the best part was the view. From the highest point on the land, you could see for miles across the valley. Tom drove out that same afternoon. The moment he stepped onto the property, he felt it. This was the place. The land had everything he had been searching for. It was peaceful, private, and absolutely beautiful. He could already picture where his house would sit, where he would plant a garden, maybe even put in a small pond. There was just one thing about the property that required some attention. The land itself didn't connect directly to the main highway. To get there, you had to use a gravel road that cut through the neighboring property. But this wasn't a problem at all, his agent explained. The property came with something called an easement. This was a legal right recorded in the deed that gave Tom permanent access to use that road. It had been there for decades, written into the property records when the land was first divided up years ago. Tom did his homework. He hired a lawyer to review all the documents. He got a survey done to make sure the boundaries were clear. He checked with the county office to verify the easement was properly recorded. Everything checked out perfectly. The paperwork was solid. He had every legal right to use that access road. In the summer of 2019, Tom paid cash for the land. It took a big chunk of his retirement savings, but it was worth it. This was going to be his forever home. The place where he would spend his retirement years. Maybe do some woodworking in a shop he planned to build, host family gatherings, and finally just enjoy the simple life he had been working toward for so long. The neighbor who owned the surrounding land was a man named Gerald. He was a local developer, pretty wealthy from what Tom could tell, and he owned about 200 acres all around Tom's property. When they first met, Gerald seemed friendly enough. He shook Tom's hand, welcomed him to the area, and even made small talk about the weather and local restaurants. Tom felt relieved. Having a good relationship with your neighbors is important, especially out in the country where properties are large and people depend on each other from time to time. Tom spent the next few months planning his dream home. He worked with an architect to design a modest but comfortable house. Nothing fancy, just a solid 3-bedroom place with a big porch where he could sit in the evenings. He got the plans approved by the county, lined up a contractor, and started ordering materials. He visited the property almost every day, walking the land, marking out where things would go, clearing some brush, and just soaking in the feeling of finally owning his own piece of earth. He even started meeting some of the other neighbors in the area. There was an older couple about a mile down the road who had lived there for 40 years. A retired school teacher on the other side who kept horses. A young family further up who ran a small organic farm. Everyone seemed welcoming and kind. The kind of rural community where people still waved when they passed each other on the road. Everything was falling into place perfectly. Tom had his land, his plans were approved, his contractor was ready to start, and he was just weeks away from breaking ground on the foundation. After all those years of dreaming and planning, it was finally happening. He would spend his evenings sitting on his temporary camping chair on the property, watching the sunset over the hills, thinking about how lucky he was. He had no idea that his peaceful retirement dream was about to turn into a nightmare. He didn't know that his friendly neighbor Gerald had other plans. He couldn't have imagined that the simple gravel road he had every legal right to use would become the center of a battle that would test everything he had. His patience, his savings, his determination, and his ability to solve problems would all be pushed to the limit. Sometimes the biggest challenges in life come from the places you least expect. And for Tom, that challenge was just around the corner, waiting for him on a quiet morning when he would drive up to his land and find his entire future blocked. Tom woke up early that morning, excited to meet his contractor at the property. They were finally going to start clearing the building site and preparing for the foundation work. He grabbed his coffee, threw on his work boots, and made the drive out to his land feeling like everything was finally coming together. As he turned onto the gravel road that led to his property, something looked wrong. Very wrong. About halfway down the road, he saw a massive pile blocking the entire path. Logs, dirt, rocks, and what looked like construction debris were stacked at least 6 feet high, completely blocking any vehicle from getting through. Tom stopped his truck and got out, his heart sinking. He walked closer to the pile, trying to understand what had happened. Had there been a storm? Some kind of accident? But the pile looked deliberately placed, arranged in a way that made it impossible to drive around. Then he heard a voice behind him. It was Gerald, his neighbor, walking up the road with his arms crossed and a stern look on his face. Tom turned to him, confused. He asked Gerald what happened, if there had been some kind of problem with the road. Gerald's response was cold and direct. He said Tom couldn't use this road anymore. Just like that. No explanation, no discussion. Tom felt his stomach drop. He pulled out the property documents from his truck, the ones that clearly showed the easement, his legal right to use this road. He showed them to Gerald, pointing out the exact language that gave him access. This wasn't just a courtesy or a handshake agreement. This was written into the deed recorded with the county, a legal right that came with the property. Gerald barely looked at the papers. He said the easement was disputed. He claimed it had been improperly recorded years ago, and that Tom had no business using his road. He had already contacted his lawyers, he said, and they were filing paperwork to challenge the easement in court. Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. Everything had been checked and verified before he bought the land. Multiple lawyers had reviewed the documents. The county had confirmed the easement. There was no dispute when he purchased the property just 6 months earlier, but Gerald wasn't interested in listening. He turned and walked back toward his property, leaving Tom standing there next to the blocked road, holding documents that suddenly felt meaningless. Tom called his contractor to let him know what happened. The contractor said he couldn't bring his equipment or materials through without access. The construction would have to be put on hold. Then Tom called his lawyer. The lawyer reviewed everything again and confirmed what Tom already knew. The easement was legitimate, properly recorded, and Tom had every legal right to use that road. But here's the thing about legal rights. Sometimes having them on paper doesn't mean much when someone decides to ignore them. Tom's lawyer explained that they could file a lawsuit to enforce the easement, but it would take time. Maybe a year, maybe longer, and there was no guarantee Gerald wouldn't drag it out even further with appeals and countersuits. Tom tried going to the county office for help. Surely someone in local government could step in and tell Gerald to remove the blockade. But the county officials, while sympathetic, said their hands were tied. This was a civil property dispute between private landowners. They couldn't force anyone to do anything. They suggested he work it out in court. Days turned into weeks. Tom's contractor had to move on to other jobs. He couldn't just sit around waiting indefinitely for access to be restored. The building materials Tom had ordered were sitting in storage, costing him money every month. His dream of building his retirement home was completely stalled. Tom drove out to the property every few days, hoping maybe Gerald had changed his mind. Maybe the blockade would be gone. But it was always there, a huge pile of debris sitting right in the middle of his only way in. He tried reaching out to Gerald directly, hoping they could talk like reasonable adults. He left messages, sent letters, even tried stopping by Gerald's main office. But Gerald wouldn't respond. His lawyer sent formal letters back, filled with legal language about disputed easements and pending litigation. The legal fees started piling up. Tom's lawyer had to file motions, respond to Gerald's claims, gather evidence, and prepare for potential court dates. Every letter, every filing, every hour of legal work cost money. And Gerald, being a wealthy developer, seemed to have unlimited resources for lawyers. He could afford to drag their... Tom lay awake at night trying to understand why this was happening. What did Gerald have to gain by blocking his access? The easement had existed for decades. Other people had used it before. Why was this suddenly a problem now? Some of the other neighbors had theories. They said Gerald was known for being territorial, that he liked controlling everything around his property. One neighbor mentioned that Gerald had plans to develop his land eventually, and maybe he saw Tom's presence as a problem for his future plans. Another suggested Gerald simply didn't like having neighbors at all and was trying to make life so difficult that Tom would give up and sell. Whatever the reason, Tom was stuck. He had invested his life savings into this land. He had spent 3 years searching for the perfect property. He had followed every rule, checked every document, done everything right. And now he was locked out of his own land by a neighbor who simply refused to honor a legal agreement. Tom sat in his truck one evening, parked as close as he could get before the blockade stopped him. He looked out at his land beyond the pile of debris, at the spot where his house was supposed to be. He had 2 choices. He could wait for the legal system to slowly grind through the case, spending more money on lawyers while his dream sat on hold. Or he could find another way. That's when Tom started looking at maps. Tom spread the topographical maps across his kitchen table and stared at them for hours. He had maps from the county, satellite images printed from online, old survey documents, and detailed property boundaries. If he couldn't use the blocked road, there had to be another way to reach his land. There just had to be. The problem was obvious the moment you looked at the maps. His property was basically surrounded by Gerald's land on 3 sides. The blocked road cut through the eastern side. On the north and south, Gerald owned everything. But on the western edge, there was a narrow section where Tom's property bordered land owned by someone else, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson who had lived there for decades. Tom studied that western boundary carefully. The terrain there was rough, really rough. It was heavily wooded, steep in places, and there was a seasonal creek that ran through it. On paper, it looked almost impossible to build a road through there. But Tom wasn't just any property owner. He had spent 30 years as a civil engineer, building roads and infrastructure in some of the most challenging environments around the world. He had worked on projects in mountains, jungles, and remote areas where most people said it couldn't be done. He started doing calculations. How steep was too steep? How wide would the road need to be? What kind of bridge would he need over the creek? Could the soil support a road? Every question led to more questions, but slowly a picture started forming in his mind. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be cheap. But it might actually be possible. The next day, Tom drove over to Mrs. Patterson's house. She was in her 70s, a retired school teacher who had bought her 10 acres back in the 80s. She kept a small garden and had a couple of horses grazing in her pasture. Tom introduced himself properly this time and explained his situation. Mrs. Patterson listened to the whole story, shaking her head. She said she wasn't surprised at all. Gerald had caused problems for several people in the area over the years. She herself had dealt with his attitude when he tried to buy her land a few years back. When she refused to sell, he had made some unpleasant comments about her property maintenance. She didn't like the man one bit. Tom asked if there was any possibility of working out an easement across a small corner of her property. It would give him access to the county road on the other side. Mrs. Patterson thought about it for a moment, then smiled. She said she would be happy to help, especially if it meant Gerald didn't get his way. She wouldn't even charge Tom much for the easement, just enough to cover her legal fees to get it properly recorded. Tom felt hope for the first time in weeks. He thanked her repeatedly and promised the road wouldn't interfere with her property or her peace and quiet. They shook hands and Tom drove home with his mind already racing through the engineering challenges ahead. Over the next few weeks, Tom brought in a civil engineering firm to do a proper survey of the proposed route. The results were daunting. The road would need to be about half a mile long, winding through dense forest. There was a 70-foot elevation change from one end to the other, which meant they would need switchbacks to keep the grade manageable. And that creek wasn't just a small stream. During spring rains, it could be 6 feet wide and 2 feet deep. They would need a real bridge. The engineering firm gave Tom an estimate that made his head spin. Between clearing the trees, moving earth, building the bridge, and paving or graveling the road, they were looking at costs that exceeded what he had paid for the land itself. And that was just for materials and contractor work. The labor costs would push it even higher. Most people would have given up right there. The numbers didn't make sense. It would be cheaper to sell the land and start over somewhere else. But Tom had already lost 6 months of his life to this fight. He had watched his retirement dream get blocked by someone who was just being spiteful, and something inside him refused to let Gerald win. Tom made a decision that surprised even himself. He would do as much of the work as he could on his own. He had operated heavy machinery before on various job sites. He knew how to read terrain and plan excavation. He couldn't do everything himself, but he could do enough to cut the costs significantly. He started calling old colleagues from his engineering days, people he had worked with on projects around the world. He explained the situation, and several of them offered to help. One knew a contractor who specialized in rural road building and owed him a favor. Another had connections to a steel supplier who could provide materials for the bridge at a discount. A third offered to come out for a week and help with the actual construction, just for the challenge of it. Tom pulled together a plan. He would hire contractors for the most technical parts, the bridge construction and the initial excavation. But he would personally handle the clearing, some of the grading work, and the finishing touches. He would rent equipment instead of paying contractors to bring their own. He would source materials carefully, finding deals wherever he could. He filed all the necessary permits with the county. Since the road would be entirely on his property and Mrs. Patterson's, and since both of them approved, the permits went through without issues. Gerald couldn't block this because he had no legal standing. The road wouldn't cross his property at all. When Tom showed his plans to a few friends, they thought he was crazy. Building a road from scratch through difficult terrain? At his age? With his own money and labor? It seemed impossible. The smart thing would be to wait for the lawsuit to work its way through the courts. But Tom had done impossible things before. He had built bridges in places where people said it couldn't be done. He had created roads through jungles and over mountains. This was his land, his dream, and his future. And if Gerald thought blocking one road would stop him, he was about to learn just how determined Tom could be. Tom bought his first piece of equipment the following week. A used excavator that still ran strong. He had it delivered to Mrs. Patterson's property, where he would begin work. As he climbed into the operator's seat that first morning, looking at the dense forest ahead of him, he smiled. This was going to be one heck of a project. The first day of clearing was harder than Tom expected. The forest was thick with decades of growth, and every tree seemed to be in exactly the wrong spot. He fired up the excavator early in the morning, the engine roaring to life in the quiet countryside. The plan was to clear a path about 12 feet wide, just enough for a single-lane road with some room on the sides. By noon, he had cleared maybe 50 feet. His back ached. His hands were sore from gripping the controls, and he was covered in dirt and sawdust. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work. Every tree he removed, every boulder he moved was one step closer to solving his problem. One step closer to his land. Mrs. Patterson came out around lunchtime with sandwiches and lemonade. She sat on her porch watching him work, cheering him on like he was running a marathon. She told him stories about the area, about how things used to be before Gerald bought up so much land and started causing trouble for everyone. The work continued like that for weeks. Tom would arrive at sunrise and work until his body couldn't take any more. Some days he made good progress. Other days he hit unexpected problems. There were massive rocks buried just below the surface that needed to be broken up or moved. There were sections where the soil was too soft and needed reinforcement. There were days when it rained and everything turned to mud, making work impossible. But slowly the path began to take shape. What started as a narrow clearing through the woods began to look like it might actually become a road. Tom brought in a contractor to help with the most technical parts of the excavation, especially dealing with the steep sections where they needed to cut into the hillside and create switchbacks. Word spread quickly through the small community about what Tom was doing. The couple who lived down the road stopped by one Saturday with coffee and donuts. They said they admired what he was doing, standing up to Gerald instead of backing down. The young family from the organic farm brought fresh vegetables and offered to help on weekends. Even people Tom had never met started showing up, curious about the project. One of Tom's old engineering buddies flew in for a week to help design and build the bridge over the creek. They used salvaged steel beams from a demolished building, getting them at a fraction of what new materials would have cost. The bridge design was simple but solid. Nothing fancy, just strong enough to handle loaded trucks and built to last through spring floods. The local hardware store owner, a guy named Bill who had dealt with Gerald's attitude before, started giving Tom discounts on materials. He said anyone willing to work this hard to beat Gerald's bullying deserved a break. A concrete supplier 2 towns over heard about the project and offered to deliver gravel at cost, just to be part of the story. The story had indeed become something bigger than just Tom's personal problem. A local newspaper got wind of what was happening and sent out a reporter. The article they published painted a picture of a retired engineer refusing to be pushed around by a wealthy developer, choosing to build his own road rather than give up on his dream. The story got picked up by regional news outlets, and suddenly people from all over were following Tom's progress. Gerald wasn't happy about the attention. He sent his lawyers to check if there were any permit violations they could use to stop the construction. But Tom had been careful. Every permit was properly filed, every regulation followed. The road was entirely on property where Tom had legal permission to build. There was nothing Gerald could do about it. The work took 18 months in total. 18 months of early mornings and aching muscles. 18 months of problem-solving and improvising. 18 months of support from neighbors and strangers who believed in what Tom was doing. There were moments when Tom wondered if he had made a huge mistake. The costs kept adding up, even with all the help and discounts. His retirement savings were taking a serious hit. There were technical problems that seemed impossible to solve. There were days when the weather refused to cooperate, when equipment broke down, when progress ground to a halt, but there were also moments of triumph. The day the bridge was finally complete and held firm when they drove heavy equipment across it. The day they finished grading the last section of road. The day Tom drove his truck all the way from the county road to his property without stopping, on a road he had built with his own determination and the help of a community that had rallied around him. The finished road was beautiful in its own way. It wound through the forest, following the natural contours of the land. The switchbacks made the steep sections manageable. The bridge over the creek was solid and practical. It wasn't the easiest route to his property, but it was his route. Nobody could block it. Nobody could take it away. More importantly, the road had become more than just a way to access his land. It had become a symbol of what's possible when someone refuses to give up. When Tom drove that road, he didn't just see gravel and bridges. He saw every hour of work, every neighbor who helped, every small victory along the way. The story attracted attention beyond just the local area. People shared it online, talking about the importance of standing up for yourself and not letting bullies win. Some people called Tom stubborn. Others called him inspiring. Tom just called himself determined. With the road complete, construction on his house could finally begin. His contractor, who had waited patiently through the whole ordeal, was eager to get started. The building materials that had been sitting in storage were finally delivered. The foundation was poured. Walls started going up. Tom would sit at the end of his new road some evenings looking at the progress on his house, still hardly believing he had pulled it off. He had built a road through terrain most people said was impossible. He had done it mostly with his own hands and the help of good people who believed in doing the right thing. And Gerald's blockade? It was still there, a useless pile of debris blocking a road that no longer mattered. Tom drove past it sometimes on his way to town, just to remind himself of how far he had come. That pile of logs and dirt had been meant to stop him. Instead, it had pushed him to achieve something even better. Tom's house was finally taking shape. The walls were up, the roof was on, and he could actually walk through the rooms and imagine living there. After everything he had been through, after all the setbacks and challenges, his dream was becoming real. He would stand on the unfinished porch in the evenings looking out over the valley and feel a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. But the story wasn't quite finished yet, and it was about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. The publicity around Tom's battle with Gerald had created ripples far beyond what anyone expected. The local newspaper article had been shared thousands of times online. People loved the story of an ordinary person standing up to a wealthy bully and winning through sheer determination. News outlets from neighboring states picked it up. A few national websites ran features on it, but the attention did something else too. It brought Gerald's business practices into the spotlight in ways he definitely didn't want. Other property owners in the area started coming forward with their own stories. There was a farmer who said Gerald had tried to intimidate him into selling his land at below market value. A couple who claimed Gerald had blocked their driveway access during a similar dispute years ago. a small business owner who said Gerald had used his influence to create zoning problems for a competitor. None of these stories had gotten much attention individually. But now, with Tom's story making headlines, people started connecting the dots. Local officials who had ignored complaints before suddenly had to pay attention. The county board received dozens of calls asking why they had let one developer cause so many problems for so many people. Gerald's reputation, which he had carefully built over years, started to crumble. His development projects, which depended on county approvals and community goodwill, began hitting unexpected roadblocks. Applications that should have sailed through were suddenly being scrutinized closely. Neighbors who might have stayed quiet before were now showing up at planning meetings to voice concerns. The legal battle over the original easement was still technically ongoing. Tom's lawyer had told him it could take another year or more to fully resolve. But something interesting happened. Gerald's lawyers quietly reached out with a settlement offer. They would acknowledge the easement was valid and remove the blockade if Tom would agree to drop any potential counterclaims for damages. Tom's lawyer advised him that they could probably win damages for all the delays and costs Gerald had caused. But Tom thought about it and decided he didn't want to spend another year fighting. He had his road. He had his house under construction. Gerald removing the blockade and admitting defeat was victory enough. He accepted the settlement. The pile of debris that had sat blocking the road for nearly 2 years was finally cleared away. Not that Tom needed it anymore. His new road was better, more private, and had a much prettier view. But there was something satisfying about knowing the blockade was gone. Then came the really unexpected part. Gerald, facing mounting legal problems and bad publicity, quietly put large portions of his property up for sale. He was trying to liquidate assets, probably to pay legal fees and get out from under the negative attention. The land was offered at prices well below what he had paid for it. Tom heard about the sale from Mrs. Patterson, who heard about it from another neighbor. At first, Tom didn't think much of it. He had his land, his house, and no desire to get involved in more property dealings. But then he started thinking about who might buy that land. What if another developer came in? Someone who might be even worse than Gerald. What if the land was subdivided and turned into dense housing developments that would destroy the rural character of the area? Tom reached out to some of the neighbors who had supported him during his road building project. Together they had an idea. What if they could organize a group purchase, pool their resources, maybe bring in some conservation-minded investors and buy portions of Gerald's land to protect it from development? It wasn't easy to organize. It took months of meetings, phone calls, and negotiations. Tom helped coordinate the effort, using connections he had made during his road project. The young couple from the organic farm knew people in the sustainable agriculture community who were interested. Mrs. Patterson had connections to local conservation groups. Other neighbors contributed what they could. In the end, they managed to purchase 80 acres of Gerald's land adjacent to Tom's property and several other parcels. Some of it would be held as a conservation easement, protecting it from future development. Some would be sold to carefully selected buyers who shared the vision of keeping the area rural and peaceful. The group made sure that every sale came with deed restrictions protecting the land's character. Gerald eventually sold most of his holdings in the area and moved his business focus to another county. Some people said he learned his lesson. Others said he just found new places where people didn't know his reputation yet. Either way, he was no longer a problem for Tom and his neighbors. Tom's house was completed in late 2023. He moved in on a crisp fall morning, carrying boxes up the road he had built with his own hands. The house was everything he had dreamed of. Simple, comfortable, with that incredible view from the porch. He set up his workshop, planted a garden, and finally started living the retirement he had planned for so long. But the house and the land weren't even the best part of what Tom had gained. The best part was the community he had become part of. The neighbors who had supported him, brought him food during the long months of road building, and stood by him when things seemed impossible. The friends he had made through the whole ordeal. The sense of belonging to a place and a group of people who looked out for each other. Mrs. Patterson still brought him lemonade on hot days. The couple from down the road stopped by regularly for coffee on his porch. The young family from the organic farm invited him to dinners. He had become part of something bigger than just owning property. People still drove by sometimes to see the road Tom had built. Some were curious about the story they had read online. Others were going through their own property disputes and wanted to meet the man who had refused to give up. Tom would show them around, tell them the story, and always ended with the same piece of advice. Don't let someone else's bullying steal your dreams. There's always another way forward if you're willing to work for it. Tom sits on his porch most evenings now, watching the sunset over the hills. He thinks about that morning when he first saw the blockade, how hopeless everything seemed. He thinks about every hour spent operating that excavator, every problem solved, every small victory, and he smiles because he knows he didn't just build a road. He built something much more important. He built a life worth living on his own terms in a place he helped protect for the future.